I remember that day pretty well, actually. It was just supposed to be a normal train ride. I'd taken that route a dozen times before, commuting back and forth for work. I never thought anything weird could happen on a train. It's just a train, right? People get on, sit down, maybe read a book or stare at their phones, and then get off at their stop. Nothing special, nothing strange. But this day was different. It was late in the evening, probably around 9 p.m. I had stayed late at the office, trying to catch up on some work. By the time I got to the station, it was almost deserted. That should have been my first clue that something was off. Usually, even late at night, there are at least a handful of people waiting around. But that night, there was no one. Just me and the sound of the train tracks humming in the distance. I remember the train pulling in, and for a moment, I hesitated. It looked older than the usual trains I took, like it hadn't been used in years. The paint was chipped, and the windows were dirty, like they hadn't been cleaned in a long time. But it was late, and I just wanted to get home. So I ignored that gut feeling telling me to wait for the next one and got on. Inside, it was pretty much what you'd expect. Empty seats, dim lights, the usual. I found a spot by the window and sat down, pulling out my phone to pass the time. There were maybe 2 or 3 other people in the car with me, but they were sitting further down, not paying any attention to me. One was an older guy in a worn-out jacket, and the other looked like a college student, probably trying to get home after a long day. I didn't pay them much attention. The train started moving, and I settled in for the ride. I was scrolling through my phone, not really looking at anything in particular, just trying to keep myself occupied. After a while, though, I noticed something strange. The train wasn't stopping. Usually, there are at least 4 or 5 stops on my route, but we just kept going, speeding through the stations without slowing down. I started to feel a bit uneasy. I looked around, trying to see if anyone else was noticing this, but the other passengers didn't seem to care. The older guy was staring out the window, and the student had his headphones on, completely zoned out. I thought about getting up and asking someone what was going on, but I didn't want to seem like I was overreacting. So I just sat there, hoping we'd stop soon. Minutes passed, and we still didn't stop. By this point, I was getting really nervous. The train was going faster than usual, and the scenery outside the window was just a blur. It didn't even look like the usual route anymore. It was all dark, with just occasional flashes of light as we sped past. No buildings, no people, just darkness. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there had to be some kind of explanation. Maybe there was a problem with the tracks, or we were being rerouted for some reason. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but I noticed something weird. There was no signal, not even one bar. That was odd because I usually had at least some service on this route. I tried refreshing the page I was on, but nothing worked. It was like I was completely cut off. That's when I started to panic a bit. I stood up and walked down the aisle, thinking maybe I could find a conductor or someone who could tell me what was going on. But as I moved to the next car, I realized it was completely empty. Not a single person in sight. I went to the next car and the next, but they were all the same. Empty and silent. I turned around and went back to the car I started in, hoping maybe I'd find the older guy or the student, but when I got back, they were gone too. I stood there for a moment, not sure what to do. The train was still speeding along, and there was no sign that it was going to stop anytime soon. I went back to my seat and tried to think. There had to be a logical explanation for this. Maybe I had fallen asleep and missed my stop. Maybe the other passengers had gotten off while I wasn't looking. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was wrong, and I was starting to feel trapped. I looked out the window again, trying to get some sense of where we were, but it was still just darkness. No landmarks, no lights, nothing. It was like we were in a tunnel or something, but it didn't make sense. There were no tunnels on this route, at least none that I knew of. Then, out of nowhere, the train jerked to a stop. I was thrown forward, almost falling out of my seat. I grabbed onto the armrest to steady myself and looked around. The lights flickered for a moment, then went out completely. I was plunged into darkness, and for a second, I couldn't see anything. My heart was racing, my mind spinning with all kinds of thoughts. I reached for my phone, using it as a flashlight, but the screen was still blank. No signal. I sat there in the dark, listening. At first there was nothing, just silence. But then I started to hear it. A faint sound, like footsteps, coming from somewhere down the train. They were slow, deliberate, getting closer with each passing second. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to get up and run, but I didn't know where to go. The train was still, the doors weren't opening, and I was trapped. The footsteps got closer, and I realized they were coming from the direction of the car I had just checked. There was no way anyone could have been there. I had seen it was empty, but someone or something was there now, and it was coming towards me. I slid down in my seat, trying to make myself as small as possible, hiding in the shadows. I held my breath, my ears straining to hear. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, echoing through the empty train. Whoever it was, they were taking their time, almost like they knew I was there and wanted me to feel the fear building up. The sound got louder, closer, and then it stopped. I didn't dare move. I could feel the sweat on my forehead, my hands shaking as I gripped the seat. I didn't know what was going to happen next. For what felt like an eternity, there was just silence. Then, suddenly, a voice spoke, low and raspy, coming from just a few feet away. "You shouldn't be here," it said. I froze. My mind was racing. Who was this? What did they want? I didn't move, didn't breathe, hoping they would go away, leave me alone. But they didn't. They just stood there, the silence stretching on. Finally, I mustered up the courage to look. I slowly turned my head, peering through the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. It was too dark, too quiet. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I was too scared to make a sound. Then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the train started moving again. The lights flickered back on, and the hum of the engine filled the air. I sat up, looking around, but there was no one there. The car was empty, just like before. No sign of the person who had spoken to me. No footsteps, nothing. I sat there, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it all in my head? I didn't know. I just wanted to get off this train, to be anywhere but here. After what felt like hours, the train finally pulled into a station. I didn't wait for it to stop completely. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, practically leaping onto the platform. I didn't look back. I just ran up the stairs and out of the station, into the street where there were people, lights, noise, things that made sense. I never found out what happened on that train. I asked around, tried to find some explanation, but no one seemed to know what I was talking about. They said there wasn't any train like the one I described running on that route, especially not at that time of night. I even went back to the station a few times, hoping to see it again, but it was always the usual trains, nothing out of the ordinary. To this day, I still think about that night. I try to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that there was some rational explanation. But every time I get on a train now, I can't help but feel a little uneasy, like I'm waiting for it to happen again. And I always listen, just in case I hear those footsteps coming closer. It was one of those late nights when you just want to get home. You know, I'd been visiting a friend in the city, and by the time I left, it was already pushing midnight. I thought about taking a cab, but then I figured the train would be quicker and cheaper. Besides, the station was just a couple of blocks away, and I was used to riding the train that late. It never really bothered me before. So I make my way to the station, and it's practically deserted, which wasn't unusual for that time of night. The fluorescent lights were flickering a bit, giving the place a kind of eerie vibe, but I shrugged it off. Just my imagination, right? The train pulled in a few minutes later, and as I got on, I noticed it was almost empty too. There was just this one guy at the far end of the car, slouched over, probably asleep or something. I found a seat near the middle, set my backpack down next to me, and pulled out my phone. I figured I'd kill some time scrolling through social media until my stop came up. The train started moving, and the sound of the tracks was almost comforting in a weird way. It was the usual clack, clack, clack as the train picked up speed, nothing out of the ordinary. After a couple of stops, I noticed that the guy at the end of the car hadn't moved. I glanced up every now and then, just out of curiosity. He was still in the same position, head down, wearing this dark hoodie. I couldn't see his face. At first I thought maybe he was just drunk or passed out, but the longer I watched, the more I realized something felt off. He was too still, like unnaturally still, but I told myself to chill out. People fall asleep on trains all the time. A few more stops went by, and no one else got on. It was just me and the guy in the hoodie. The train car felt colder than usual, like someone had cranked up the AC or something. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and tried to focus on my phone, but I couldn't shake this weird feeling that something was wrong. Then, as we pulled into the next station, I noticed him move. Just a slight shift, like he was adjusting his position. I looked up, expecting him to maybe sit up or change seats, but he didn't. Instead, he slowly lifted his head, and that's when I realized he was staring right at me. I couldn't see his eyes under the hood, but I could feel them, like a heavy weight pressing down on me. I tried to play it cool, just glanced back at my phone, pretending like I hadn't noticed, but my heart was racing, and I could feel a bead of sweat trickling down my back. The train doors closed, and we started moving again. I told myself it was nothing, just some guy being weird. It's not like it was the first time I'd seen a creeper on the train, but then he started to stand up, slowly, like he was testing the waters, making sure I wasn't paying attention. My eyes darted up for a split second, and he froze, like a statue. I looked back down, trying to keep calm, but my mind was racing. What the hell was this guy doing? Was he about to come over here? Should I move to another car? I was about to grab my bag and make a run for it, when the train suddenly jerked, like it had hit something on the tracks. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, everything went dark. When they came back on, he was gone. The seat where he'd been sitting was empty. I scanned the car, my heart pounding in my chest. Where did he go? He couldn't have just disappeared. I looked toward the doors, but they were still closed. There was no way he could have gotten off without me seeing. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the window opposite me, was his reflection. He was standing right behind me. I spun around, ready to defend myself, but the aisle was empty. No one was there. I looked back at the window, but the reflection was gone. I was alone, completely alone. I stood up, my legs shaking, and backed up against the wall, trying to keep an eye on the whole car at once. I felt like I was losing my mind. The train slowed down as we approached the next station, and I made a split-second decision. As soon as the doors opened, I bolted. I grabbed my backpack and ran out onto the platform, not caring where I ended up as long as I was off that train. I didn't stop until I was out of breath, leaning against a wall, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The platform was empty. No one had gotten off the train behind me, and when I looked back, the train was already pulling away, leaving me alone in the dimly lit station. I took a deep breath, trying to calm down. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired and seeing things, but it felt so real. I checked the time. It was past midnight now, and the next train wouldn't come for another half hour. I didn't want to get back on the train, but I didn't have much of a choice. There weren't any cabs around, and walking home would take forever, so I decided to wait, but I kept glancing around, making sure I was alone. The minutes dragged on, and every little sound made me jump. The hum of the lights, the distant rumble of a passing train, the echo of my own footsteps. I felt like I was being watched, but every time I looked around, there was no one there, just me and the shadows. Finally, the next train arrived. I hesitated for a moment, but then forced myself to get on. This time, the car was empty, completely empty. I sat down near the front, close to the door, and kept my eyes fixed on the window, watching the reflections. The train started moving, and for a while, everything was normal, just the sound of the tracks and the hum of the lights. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I glanced at the reflection in the window, and my heart skipped a beat. There he was, standing at the back of the car, just standing there, watching me. I turned around, ready to confront him, but the car was empty. No one was there. I looked back at the reflection, and he was gone. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like a rat in a maze with no way out. The train kept moving, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. I just wanted to get home, to get off this goddamn train. I kept my eyes on the reflection, not daring to look away. But every time the train passed through a tunnel, or the lights flickered, he would appear again, just for a second, always in a different spot. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just my imagination, but it felt too real, too vivid. I could feel his eyes on me, like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. I was sweating, my hands gripping the edge of the seat so hard my knuckles were white. Finally, we pulled into my stop, I didn't wait for the train to come to a complete stop. As soon as the doors opened, I was out of there, running up the stairs two at a time, not looking back. I burst out onto the street, the cool night air hitting my face, and kept running until I was a few blocks away. I stopped, leaning against a building, trying to catch my breath. I looked around, expecting to see him standing there, but there was no one, just the empty street and the distant sound of the train pulling away. I didn't stop moving until I got home, slamming the door behind me and locking it, as if that would keep whatever it was from following me. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. The house was silent, and eventually, as the sun started to rise, I let myself relax, just a little. The next day, I told a couple of friends about what happened, but they just laughed it off, said it was probably just some weird guy on the train, or maybe I was just tired and seeing things. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But even now, whenever I take the train, I can't help but glance at the reflections in the windows, looking for that figure in the hoodie. And every once in a while, I swear I see him, just for a second, standing at the back of the car, watching me. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the right moment to make his move. I don't take the train late at night anymore. I'd rather walk, even if it takes longer. At least then I feel like I have some control, like I'm not trapped in a metal box with nowhere to go. Because sometimes the real terror isn't what you see, it's what you don't. It's the shadows in the corner of your eye, the feeling of being watched when you're alone, the sense that something is there, just out of sight, waiting. And that's what stays with you. Not the image, but the feeling. The cold, creeping dread that makes you question what's real and what's not. That makes you look over your shoulder, even in the safety of your own home. That makes you wonder if you'll ever truly be alone again. Alright, so this happened a few years ago when I was taking a train trip to visit a friend in another city. It wasn't a super long journey, maybe about 4 hours or so, but it was enough time to just sit back, relax, and watch the scenery go by. I've always enjoyed train rides. There's something calming about the steady rhythm of the tracks, the gentle swaying of the cars, but this particular trip ended up being anything but relaxing. I got to the station early in the morning. It was one of those chilly days where the fog hangs low, and everything feels kind of muted. The station wasn't too crowded, just the usual mix of business commuters and a few travelers like me. I grabbed a coffee and a bagel from a kiosk, then made my way to the platform. When the train pulled up, it looked pretty standard. Old, but not in a charming way. Just worn down, like it had seen better days. I climbed aboard and found my seat, a window seat, which I always try to get. There were a few other people in the car, but it wasn't packed, so I had some space to myself. I settled in, put on my headphones, and waited for the train to start moving. Once we were on our way, I just kind of zoned out, staring out the window at the passing landscape. For the first hour or so, everything was fine. I even dozed off a little, lulled by the motion of the train. But then something woke me up. It was this sudden jolt, like the train hit something on the tracks. I sat up, pulled my headphones off, and looked around. Nobody else seemed to notice or care, so I figured it was nothing and tried to relax again. But then I noticed it. The car I was in seemed a little off. It's hard to explain, but there was this weird vibe, like, you know how sometimes you can just feel asterisk when something isn't right? That's what it felt like. The lights flickered every now and then, and the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I brushed it off as my imagination, but it kept gnawing at me. A little while later, I decided to get up and stretch my legs. I walked through a couple of cars, just checking things out. Most of them were the same. Old, a bit dingy, but nothing too unusual. But then I got to this one car near the back of the train. It was almost empty, just a couple of people sitting towards the far end. What struck me though was how silent it was. No one was talking, no one was moving. They were just sitting there, staring straight ahead. It was creepy, to say the least. I walked through that car quickly, trying not to make eye contact with anyone. I don't know why, but something about it just gave me the chills. When I got to the next car, I felt this weird sense of relief, like I had just escaped something. I went back to my seat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Long train rides can do that to you, right? But as the journey went on, things got weirder. I kept hearing these faint sounds, almost like whispers, but every time I looked around, no one was talking. And then there were the shadows. Out of the corner of my eye, I kept seeing these quick, darting movements, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just empty seats and the dimly lit interior of the train car. At one point, I convinced myself that I needed some fresh air, or at least the train equivalent of it. I headed to the little vestibule area between cars, where you can kind of stand and look out the window. It's not really fresh air, but it felt less stifling than being inside the car. I stood there for a few minutes, just watching the trees and fields blur by, trying to calm my nerves. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was trying to sneak up on me. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. Just the empty corridor leading back to the other cars. My heart was racing at this point. I knew I hadn't imagined those footsteps. They were real, and they were close. I backed up against the door, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I felt it, a cold draft coming from behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, and to my horror, I realized the door to the outside was slightly ajar. Just a crack, but enough for the wind to seep through. I hadn't opened it, and as far as I knew, it was supposed to be locked during the trip. I quickly pulled the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling. I didn't know what was going on, but I knew I didn't want to be in that vestibule any longer. I rushed back to my seat, my mind racing with thoughts. Was someone messing with me? Or was I just losing it? Back in my seat, I tried to act normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around the car, but everyone else seemed oblivious. Some were sleeping, others were reading or staring at their phones. But then I noticed something strange. There was this man sitting a few rows ahead of me. He was turned slightly, just enough so that I could see the side of his face. He was staring at me, not in a casual way, but with this intense, almost predatory look. I felt a surge of panic. I quickly looked away, pretending like I hadn't noticed, but I could feel his eyes on me, boring into me. My mind was screaming at me to do something, but I didn't know what. Should I confront him? Move to another car? I didn't want to make a scene, but I also didn't want to sit there and wait for something bad to happen. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally turned away, facing forward again. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I kept my eyes on him, though, watching for any sudden movements. I was on high alert, my nerves frayed. A little while later, the train started to slow down. I checked my watch and realized we were coming up on a small station. Not my stop, but I seriously considered getting off and catching another train. Anything to get away from whatever was going on. But as we pulled into the station, something strange happened. The man who had been staring at me got up and moved to the door, like he was getting off. But then he just stood there, waiting, watching. The train came to a stop and the doors opened. A few people got on, but no one got off, including the man. He just stood there, staring out the open door, not moving. It was the creepiest thing I'd ever seen. I was on the edge of my seat, ready to bolt if he made a move. But then, just as the doors were about to close, he stepped out onto the platform. He turned back for a second, locking eyes with me one last time. His expression was unreadable, but it sent a shiver down my spine. And then the doors closed, and he was gone. I sat there, trying to process what had just happened. My mind was racing with questions. Who was that guy? Why was he staring at me? And what the hell was up with his train? The rest of the ride was tense, but nothing else happened. No more shadows, no more footsteps, and thankfully, no more creepy men staring at me. When we finally pulled into my station, I grabbed my stuff and got off that train as fast as I could. I didn't look back, didn't wait to see who else was getting off. I just wanted to get away from that train and whatever weirdness was attached to it. It's been a while since that trip, but I still think about it sometimes. I never figured out what was going on, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. I still take trains occasionally, but I always make sure I'm not alone in the car, and I keep an eye out for anything strange. That feeling like something was watching me, it stuck with me. And every now and then, when I'm on a train, I'll catch myself glancing over my shoulder, just to make sure there's no one there. I guess it's just one of those things that will always stay with me. A reminder that sometimes, even in the most mundane places, Things can get really creepy really fast, and maybe it's better not to know what's lurking out there, watching, waiting.